My name is Jim Lewis, and I'm the Visitor Services and Cultural Resources Manager at Stones River National Battlefield. The Battle of Stones River is, in size and scope, one of the major battles of the Civil War. It had some 81,000 men engaged here between the Army of Tennessee on the Confederate side and the Army of the Cumberland on the United States side. And when it was done, almost 24,000 of those soldiers would be dead, wounded, or captured. So almost 30% of both armies. But what truly makes the battle significant is, one, it pushes the Confederates out of this portion of Middle Tennessee, allowing the Union then to set up Murfreesboro as its base of operations for its next campaigns, which will see them ultimately take the city of Chattanooga, then go on to Atlanta, the March to the Sea, and beyond. And it's the victory that supports the Emancipation Proclamation as it goes into effect. So William Rosecrans was, like many of the officers who served in the Civil War, was a West Point graduate. Graduated pretty high in his class, in fact, so he went on to be part of the engineers. And he would leave the Army for civilian life, return to it as the Civil War gets going, and pretty quickly begins rising up the ranks. He will have successes in West Virginia against Robert E. Lee, which will then get him assigned to the Army of the Tennessee under Ulysses S. Grant. He'll have victories at Corinth and Iuka down in Mississippi, and then he will be given the command of the Army of the Cumberland in October of 1862, which will set the stage for the Battle of Stones River. Rosecrans was a Catholic. In fact, he was helped be converted to Catholicism by his chief of staff, Julius Garrichet, who is also here at the Battle of Stones River, will perish, in fact, during the Battle of Stones River, right in front of his good friend Rosecrans. He's actually struck by a cannonball in the head, and one of the most spectacular sniper shots of the Battle of Stones River. So he was a devout Catholic. They're actually up just a little ways from where we're standing right now on the tracks of the Nashville-Chattanooga Railroad, which are raised above the rest of the ground, watching as the final fight takes place during the afternoon of December 31st, 1862. It's actually Rosecrans, Garrichet, and the rest of his staff, George Thomas, his second in command, and his staff, and Thomas Crittenden, commander of the left wing, and his staff. So it's a big gaggle of officers, which attracts the attention of a Confederate battery on the other side of the river. They fire an exploding shell, and it's fused round. It's supposed to kind of burn down and explode over the top of this big group of officers. But I guess thankfully for the United States side, the fuse failed to explode, because it otherwise might have decapitated the Army of the Cumberland. But instead would actually hit Julius Garrichet square in the head, actually splattered some of his brains on Rosecrans's chest. Rosecrans did not react much at the moment. I mean, he's in the middle of the fight for his life. His army is clinging to its lifeline, but then it settles in at the end of the day. Garrichet was beloved throughout the Army. In fact, the detail that would go out to find his remains and rebury him that evening would be made up of no one under the rank of colonel. Colonel William B. Hazen was one of the men that went out there, but it was also included George Thomas, Rosecrans himself, and several other brigadier generals and colonels searched the grounds to find him at the end of the evening and have him buried before he was later sent back and ultimately ends up in Arlington National Cemetery. One thing they always say, there's no atheists in foxholes, right? So, of course, we didn't have foxholes during the Civil War, but certainly, you get a little closer to speaking to your maker when your life is literally on the line every day. And the Civil War, it is every day. Soldiers come to the realization pretty quickly that although the battles are bad, when you join up with a 1,000-man regiment to start training, and this is true of my great-great-great-grandfather, who joined up, he and his son joined up in the 13th Georgia. He never left the state. Within 2 months, he was dead of dysentery. And the soldiers understand that in a lot of ways, camp is more deadly to you than the battlefield is. And so they really are facing the possibility every single day. And I think at that time, people's religion played a far greater role in their everyday lives than it did before. The town preacher or priest, the churches were kind of the bedrock of that community, and that carries with. In fact, most of these chaplains that are part of these volunteer units are not your well-trained military chaplains that we have today in the United States Army, but are in fact the local, one of the local priests or reverends, coming from one of the churches in town and going along with the men. They're literally accompanying them to shepherd their mini flock as they go out into the world of the Civil War. And they plug into everything. I mean, Chaplain Charles Quintard, who's the chaplain of the 1st Tennessee Infantry, he's actually an Episcopalian bishop, so he takes a little bit of a pay cut to go down and be a chaplain of a regiment, but he's also the surgeon, the chief surgeon of the regiment as well. He's a medical doctor as well as being the carer of their souls, as they go along. So he can be performing surgery one moment and then giving last rites the next. The solace they provide to the soldiers. I mean, Sunday services, you read soldiers' letters. The church services that they hold, in the midst of Fortress Rosecrans as they're building it, they actually have in the readouts, they have little cross-shaped block houses. So they say, well, how perfect is that? I mean, we're going to have our church service in here are important. And on the battlefield itself, I mean, they're ubiquitous. I mean, the stories of chaplains that are just moving around from person to person, taking care of the wounded as they can, giving comfort and solace, and in the cases of those that are Catholic, giving them last rites. I mean, that comfort as they go out the door is everywhere. I mean, most specifically here at the Battle of Stones River, Chaplain John Whitehead actually, for his service, being essentially almost everywhere as an angel on the battlefield, rendering all types of aid that I described and then some, will actually end up earning the Medal of Honor, one of the 11 Medal of Honor recipients here at the Battle of Stones River. Charles Parsons, who commands batteries H and M of the 4th U.S. Artillery here at the Battle of Stones River, this will be his final battle. He will resign his commission and become an Episcopalian priest. And well, actually, his greatest claim to fame, you can find him by Googling him, but you probably won't find him listed for his Civil War service. He will actually run the Diocese of Memphis, Tennessee, and in 1878, with the yellow fever outbreak, when other charitable and religious organizations will basically run for cover and deny assistance, he opens up his church, ministers to the sick, and himself succumbs to yellow fever. And that, when you Google Charles Parsons, that's what's going to come up first. And so, something happened to him during this conflict, because you'll find his name featured prominently at places like Perryville, Kentucky, Shiloh, and here at Stones River. So he's certainly a capable soldier, and an artillery, to boot, which is my favorite. But it's not long after the Battle of Stones River, something changed. And, we don't know what that is. That happens in here. And he just said, I'm done with that. And went off to something else, which ultimately he lives through all this along Asbury Lane. But Price's brigade is actually assigned to guard McFadden's Ford, the river crossing that the Union Army, at the beginning of the battle, Rosecrans wanted to cross about 1/3 of his army to put in his left wing and sweep into the town of Murfreesboro. That doesn't work because the Confederates smashed the Union right way earlier. So when Rosecrans shifts gears to make a defense of the Nashville Pike, he pulls the bulk of Van Cleve's division this way to be a part of that, but he doesn't want to leave his back door open. And so Price's brigade will basically remain at McFadden's Ford during the 31st fight. Now, that doesn't get him out of it, because January 1st, that evening, it'll be Van Cleve's division that will cross the Stones River again. They will take up position on the hill overlooking the ford on the east bank of the Stones River, and they will be engaged by John Breckinridge's division on the afternoon of January 2nd, 1863 at that site, and be driven off of that field and then counterattack later after 57 Union cannons inflict almost 40% casualties on Breckinridge's force. So almost all of his activity, he would have been giving that absolution right up somewhere. When you get up there, you'll see a big white spire monument. We call it the Artillery Monument. Somewhere in the vicinity of that would be where that would have taken place. Well, I mean, the immigrant soldiers do face challenges, but they immigrated to the United States. And the vast majority of immigrants will actually put on blue, not gray. A lot of it depends on geography, of course, but you have a very heavy Irish contingent that actually comes down and will be in the South. I mean, the most famous of which would be like Patrick Cleburne and whatnot. But a lot of your folks that are retreating, particularly the ones that are coming over in those waves after the failure of the 1848 revolutions in Europe and the backlash that happens to those from, well, we call it Germany, from the Germanic states and places like that, will tend to gravitate to, some of the more northern climes, possibly because of that, but also they see the United States as kind of what they were hoping to do when they were part of that revolutionary fervor. And so when the war breaks out, they actually look at what the Confederacy stands for, which is a pretty patriarchal society, no doubt, particularly with slavery at the bottom rung of that. And they feel like preserving the Union is what they need to fight for. That, I mean, they fought for it back in their home countries and it failed if they don't step up now. So, I mean, they do actually see it as sort of an extension of what they had been fighting for when they were in Europe. Of course, with them though, you'll have language barriers. There are differences, although you don't see a whole lot of friction in the Army over various type, Episcopalians tend to get along with, Catholics and, the Methodists and Baptists and, and actually, of course, you have Northern Baptists and Southern Baptists. I mean, the issue of slavery is essentially torn apart much of particularly the Protestant faith in the United States. You almost have two different groupings, those that, kind of keep to the teachings they had, and the ones in the South had to sort of morph and incorporate support of slavery into their teachings. So, there are, I grew up in a Methodist church in the North, and I stepped into a Methodist church down here, and I didn't know what the heck I was getting into, because it was a totally different animal altogether, more on the evangelical side of things. So, but I'd say the language barrier was probably the biggest issue for most of them. A lot of units actually had commanders who could speak their native tongue to them, get the orders, so they had essentially translators with them. Of course, that could go bad if your colonel gets shot. So then what do you do after that? The place where it's probably the most challenging, though, is not actually in the individual volunteer regiments, because they tended to come from places, the same town, the same place. So it was like an all-German regiment or an all-Swedish regiment or Norwegian or whatever it may be. It's in the U.S. Army, because a lot of them do gravitate to the U.S. regiments, the 16th U.S. Infantry or the 4th U.S. Artillery, and they're all mixed up. And so you could sit around a fire there and hear like 12 guys talking 12 different languages, and do they even understand what's going on? And trying to get them to drill together and work together was a really big problem. The 24th Wisconsin, and we know a lot about them because actually in our museum, one of the soldiers that he ministered to, Christian Nix, was killed here at the Battle of Stones River. He was a lieutenant commanding one of the companies here. And we actually have a picture of Christian, and he's one of those immigrants. We have from his family basically everything from his birth certificate in Germany all the way through to, we actually have the headboard, the little wooden piece that was used to mark his original grave. So we literally own him cradle to grave. and he was a member of the 24th. They will be engaged now. Some of the heaviest fighting they'll be in will be on the south side of the Wilkinson Pike, which is the southern boundary of the park today. When you go down to our tour stop number 2, into the area known as the Slaughter Pen. Now the rocky area of the Slaughter Pen is actually the position of some of James Negley's division troops, but as you're walking around the loop trail and you're standing at a wayside that talks about Sheridan's division facing to the south towards the Wilkinson Pike, look off to your right down that tree line and you'll be looking at the position of the 24th Wisconsin. In that last stage of the fight where they and Sheridan and Negley will hold on from about 2 hours from 10 a.m. until noon, help stall about half the Confederate Army, giving Rosecrans the time he needs to build the line that will finally turn the tide here at the Nashville Pike. So, but in the process, we'll lose, in some regiments' cases, lose about 50% of their men. Julius Garrichet was an immigrant like others. He was actually born of French parents who were actually doing missionary work in Cuba. So for some strange reason, he appears in the Park Service as Hispanics in the Civil War book, but don't take that to heart. Just because you're born in Cuba doesn't mean you're Hispanic. But he was Rosecrans's, here at the Battle of Stones River, the adjutant of the Army. He's basically Rosecrans's chief assistant. He oversees making sure that all the orders that Rosecrans wants, that they get written out by his staff and sent out, and kind of coordinates things from below. He doesn't actually issue the orders, but he's the one whose name appears on almost everything that goes in and out. And he was, like I said, beloved within the Army's command structure. We don't know as much about him as we really like, but you can definitely tell by the people's reactions to his death and what they, the few things that we can glean that they said about him, that he was definitely part of the Army of the Cumberland family, one of the rocks of it, for sure. There's actually a convent down in Mississippi that has some connection to him, and the nuns will come up every 4 or 5 years, and they'll kind of head over to the little field between the cemetery and the round forest over there, because that's the site where he was killed. So yeah, they'll pop in every once in a while, and they want to. Yeah. Well, and he had a premonition before the battle. I mean, he actually writes his brother about a week earlier that he doesn't feel like he'll live to see the other side of this coming fight, and he was right. Here at the Battle of Stones River, David Stanley was the Army of the Cumberland's chief of cavalry. He has been tasked by Rosecrans with the very big lift of trying to make the Union Army's cavalry on par with the Confederate mounted arm, which is, it is the most feared part of the Confederate Army in 1862, bar none. His job is only partially finished by the time the Battle of Stones River begins. He's managed to begin to form his cavalry into brigades and divisions, and given them some training and some different armament, which would, hopefully put them on par with the enemy. But as we'll see here at the Battle of Stones River, the Confederate cavalry still has the upper hand. But as we move into 1863 and the Tullahoma campaign, and later the drive for Chattanooga, we will see Stanley's efforts pay bountiful fruits, as the Union cavalry will run roughshod over their Confederate counterparts during those later 1863 campaigns. And so he was hand chosen by Rosecrans, so it does not surprise me that he too ultimately becomes a convert, because Rosecrans doesn't need his own priests. He likes to talk theology and stuff all the time with his guys, try to get a few more into the family as he's moving along. So, and longer than Thomas in the sense, because Rosecrans has been working with Stanley since Iuka and the Corinth campaign. He will essentially inherit Thomas when he takes command of the Army of the Ohio, later renamed the Army of the Cumberland from Don Carlos Buell. And that's an interesting little byplay there, because Thomas had been offered command of that army in the midst of the Kentucky campaign. He correctly refuses, because you don't switch horses while you're in the middle of a campaign. Once that campaign is over, but Buell does not chase the Confederates back into Tennessee, he is removed. I suspect Thomas is thinking he's going to get another offer, but he doesn't. Here comes this, this little kind of nervous, full of energy, ball of energy guy, Rosecrans, who he knows didn't get promoted to general until after him, but somebody went back in and erased and put a new date in there and made him commander of the army. Thomas could have very easily pitched a fit and made a real trouble over it, but he is the consummate soldier. He actually is critical to Rosecrans being able to, in a very short time, begin to forge this army into a team and at least set it in position to be able to hold its ground here at the Battle of Stones River. The job is not finished. That will actually take place in the 6 months after the battle. But then when the Army of the Cumberland steps off at the end of June 1863, it is something to behold. So just to address the, quote, mistake made of drawing Wood's division out of line at Chickamauga and, creating a hole where there wasn't one, yes, that was a mistake, but actually that mistake saves lives. Because Wood is pulled out and starts heading up towards Thomas's part of the line, because Thomas is calling because that flank is getting hammered, right? Well, Wood's division is sitting right where the sledgehammer of Longstreet's corps in columns of divisions is going to attack. Do you think for 1 second Wood's division would have stopped that? No. So you could have just X'd out that entire division as casualties. By moving them, they'll actually be where Thomas needs them to make his stand on Snodgrass Hill. So yes, it was a mistake, but actually it's a mistake that works in the Union Army's favor, because nothing was going to stop Longstreet from breaking that line. Now, Rosecrans overall, his problem at Chickamauga is he is really very disconnected. I mean, he is a general that likes to be a little bit of a micromanager. Here at Stones River, that works out perfectly, because as his army starts to fall apart, as he has to start struggling to save the Nashville Pike, his soldiers are running back out of these trees, back to the road, and it looks like they're not going to stop till they hit the Ohio River. But then they see their general riding around, going up to a group of 50 guys and saying, "You men, hold this line." Now, that's not the job of a major general in charge of the army, but by God, that was exactly what was needed for those soldiers to see their general riding hither and thither. They got to all see him. Now, Chickamauga, that doesn't really happen. Why? Because Rosecrans is basically in the midst of a physical and almost mental breakdown. This campaign, basically, these couple of weeks as they're crossing Lookout Mountain, almost get trapped in McLemore's Cove, trying to maneuver and, keep Bragg from cutting him off from Chattanooga, Rosecrans is getting about 2 hours of sleep a night for nearly 3 solid weeks. And it finally comes home to roost. Rosecrans has no physical or mental energy really left to do the things you would normally expect of him to do. And when he does make decisions like, Wood's division, it actually is wrong. And so when things, particularly when the Chickamauga retreat happens and Rosecrans' headquarters is overrun, he's sort of caught up in that thing, and George Thomas is pretty much left on the field, which is what's left of the army. And then for weeks after that in Chattanooga, that's what actually leads to, he's almost comatose. And what he's doing is essentially he's still not recovered from depriving him, because he didn't like to sleep. But on normal days, you get 4 or 5 hours, and you wouldn't be in the midst of a sustained campaign and marching and riding and doing big thinking and making big decisions. If it happened in camp, no big deal. Eventually, but this just wore him out to the nub. Well, the only other chaplain I'd mention, because you look over into Stones River National Cemetery, chaplains are part of that too. Our first superintendent of our cemetery, and many of the national cemeteries, there are chaplains in the quartermaster's department. and they will be the ones that, Earnshaw is the one that coordinates with the 111th United States Colored Infantry and pulls the vast majority of the Civil War soldiers, about 6,100, into our cemetery. So many of those very first superintendents of this very new system, this national cemetery system, are in fact, men of the cloth.